Okay, so welcome back to racial and ethnic minorities. Um, Today, we are going to discuss stop talking about race, colorblind ideology. Okay. This is for the week of January 31st through February 4th. Um, you also should see some grades or at least one grade. So I'll try to start getting those back to you. Discussions and class assignments and things like that, those should be coming in periodically. Also, again, encourage you to come in during office hours if you have questions or you just want to talk about the class and you have questions about the readings. I've really been enjoying that. So for those students who do so, feel free to do that. First thing, if you go to the next slide, there is a quiz. So I'm not sure when you will be looking at this video, but as always, the video is prepared and uploaded by Monday. So this will be available for you on January 31st, and then you can look at it whenever you want. But you will have a quiz available on Friday, February 4th. So it will cover the reading essay 5 if people stop talking about race. The quiz will be 5 to 10 questions related to the reading. The questions to the quiz will be available under modules. And as you know, when you click on whatever, if it's a class assignment or a discussion, it'll take you to it. So it'll take you to the reading quizzes, or you can just go straight to the reading quizzes link, and it'll be entitled Quiz 1, Colorblind. And it'll be available at midnight on Friday. So you have Thursday, 11:59 at Friday, midnight. That is when it will be available. And you will have 24 hours to complete it until 11:59 on February 4th. So you have until that time to complete the exam. So anytime on Friday you can do it. If you're a late sleeper, if you go to sleep super late, then I would probably suggest doing it early. If you go to sleep early and you wake up in the morning, maybe you can wake up in the morning and do it. Maybe as soon as you get off work. Not really sure what your schedules are, but it'll be available on that Friday. And you will have that entire Friday to complete it. So the questions will be in a Microsoft Word document. On a separate Microsoft Word document, you can record your answers to the questions. And then you will go to the assignments link and click on reading quizzes, and the portal that says Quiz 1 Colorblind, where it says submit, you will then submit it there. You will upload your answers there. No submissions after the deadline will be graded under any circumstances. Okay. So if you have questions, reach out to me during my office hours. I do have some late, I do allow late work. You have that 24 to 48 hour window for your late work, but with quizzes, that's not the case. And I talk about that in the syllabus. So yeah, I talk about that there. So feel free to revisit that. If you have questions, reach out to me during my office hours, and I'll be more than happy to answer those questions. And those submissions after the deadline will be graded. And the deadline for the quiz, again, just reiterating, is midnight on Friday, February 4th. So, sorry, it's 11:59. I like to say 11:59 because I say it's available on midnight, but it's technically it might be like midnight, February 5th, but then sometimes that throws students off. So I just like to say 11:59 p.m. That's when it's due. All right. So yeah, any questions? Feel free to reach out. So by now, hopefully you read, stop talking about race. You read Essay 5. Hopefully you have also read Benia Silva's Colorblind Racism, which we will discuss later as well, later on in this lecture. But yeah, that is what we're going to be talking about this for the next, however long. So, color blindness, right? Color blindness. The idea of color blindness is a post-civil rights notion that was put in place as a way of attempting to as a way of creating a discourse, attempting to move our American society past race. When we say move it past race, what we're saying is the issue of race, the concept of race, at some point seemed to hinder the progress that America was making as a global leader. It was also something that other countries were seeing as a hindrance and oftentimes a hypocritical position made by the United States. How can you come to my country and tell us how to treat our people? How can you talk about democracy and freedom? How can you talk about equality, self-governance? But yet and still, there are so many people in your country that are clearly victims of disparities. How can we believe in democracy? How can we believe in the free market and capitalism and all of these different philosophies that you preach? How can you tell us that we're doing something wrong when you have not completely resolved the problem, the racial problem that is endemic in your country's history? And so it has and continues to be a stain in the American story. It continues to be a stain in the American marketing campaign of being a land of opportunity. And so colorblindness was a notion that really became popular in the 80s and 90s as a way of helping to kind of push past race. Instead of dealing with it, let's just pretend it doesn't exist at all. Let's just close our eyes to it. And if we close our eyes tight enough, and if we cover it up enough, maybe it will just go away. And so with the notion of colorblindness, you have this suggestion that most white people believe that race no longer matters when it comes to getting ahead in the United States. Colorblindness doesn't suggest that there's no such thing as white or black or Asian or Latinx or any other racial group. But it says that those types of that categorization for people does not advance or inhibit one from becoming successful. So when we think about colorblindness, it's really saying not that we don't see color, but that color does not matter. Now, there are situations where people say we don't see color. We will talk about that as well. But it is this idea that, yes, I recognize your difference, but that's not going to bear, that's not going to hold any bearing on if you got a job or if you didn't get a job. If you can take care of your family or if you can't take care of your family, if you can live in this neighborhood or if you can't, if you can pass, those things don't matter. What matters in those terms depends on when you had the opportunity, did you take advantage? Did you do well in school? Did you get a good education? Did you do well on your job? But race is not going to determine if you get a job or if you have access or the opportunity to get a job, or if you have the opportunity to get an education. Race is not going to matter. Because in America, we all have that right. In the United States, we all have the right to a good education. We all have the right to good health care. We all have the right to a job, a well-paying job that allows for us to take care of our families. We all have that right. Now, what you do with that as an individual, well, that's on you. If you play around in your job and you get fired, that has nothing to do with race. If you got an education, but you slept in class, you didn't do your work, you didn't take advantage of this education and you flunked out, that's on you. If you chose to live a life of crime and you get caught up with drugs and you go to prison or you go to jail, that has nothing to do with race. That's all on you. That's colorblindness. So there are two sub themes that we think about when we think about colorblindness. One is that a person should think and act towards others without acknowledging skin color. That's one. Now, most people don't necessarily, a lot of white people don't think that way. Most white people feel like, well, we can acknowledge that this person is black, this person is white, this person is, and then we also get terms like colored, and people still use the term colored, which is a pejorative term. So please don't use it on any of your papers unless you're using it within a historical context, like the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, you know, that kind of thing. But, you know, if you're using it in a present day context, I wouldn't use the term colored. But most people will still acknowledge that people are of a different racial group. That's fine. But there are some people who say, I don't even see it at all. I don't even want to say that you're black, say that I'm white, say that you're Latinx, say that I'm Asian, say that I don't even want to say it because you're not those things. You're just human. I've heard people say, well, if color doesn't exist, then why do we stop at traffic lights? Well, the reason why is because we see color. Color exists. Color lets us know things. When we see red light, we stop. When we see a red stop sign, we stop. When we see a green light, we go. Colors have meaning. And if we go back to all the, real sociology stuff, it gets down to the symbolic interaction, the meanings that exist within our society that gives us directions. But there are still people who say, I don't see color. We'll talk more about that later. Then there's another theme under colorblindness that says race no longer determines the life chances in the United States, what I just said. So I see race, I see color, I know that it exists, but race is not going to determine who has access to what. I turn on the TV, I see black people all the time. I see Asian people all the time. Look at our politics. We have a black vice president. We have a white president. They're working together. We see Asian people in leadership. We see Latinx people in leadership and in power as presidents of universities and vice presidents and provosts and deans and professors. So clearly, race does not determine life chances anymore. Clearly, these people have reached these levels of success, and they are of whatever minority racial group. And it's not just one, we see quite a bit. So clearly we live in a colorblind society. That means if these people can do it, if I can see Oprah Winfrey, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Jay-Z, whoever, Robert Johnson, those people just happen to be Black, but right, people of Elon Musk, he's South African. Jeff Bezos, I believe he's Mexican or Latinx. I believe he has Latinx ancestry. Right. So clearly, race didn't stop them. Why do you say it's stopping you? We clearly live in a colorblind society. This also, colorblindness, allows white people to remain comfortable in the status quo. So a person who believes in colorblindness, and it's not just white people who believe in colorblindness, there are definitely minorities who believe in it as well. However, there are less minorities who would adopt the idea of colorblindness than there are white people. But it allows for white people to remain comfortable in the status quo. Well, when we look at these statistics of Black people going to jail, if we look at these statistics of Latinx people in jail or being sent back to other countries because they are not citizens, and when we see these examples of Asian Americans being successful, this allows us to see the status quo, the stereotypes that we assign to certain groups, and say, well, it must be this way for a reason. It's not because of race, because we see all these examples of successful ones. So that means they must have done something wrong. They're coming over here and not learning the language. They're criminals in their neighborhoods, wearing the hoodies and listening to rap music. These people are smarter. It allows for the status quo to be comfortable. And uses and justifies or uses this thematic principle as a justification for why everything is the same and maybe should not remain the same, but it is the same and it's not a systemic problem. And so colorblindness says that the cause of racism is not racism itself, it's not the system itself, it's not the structures that perpetuate racism itself. In fact, it's the people that are always bringing it up. It's the liberal agenda. Every time something happens, you want to get Cornel West, you want to get Mark Lamont Hill, you want to get Jelani Favors, you want to get Angela Rye, you want to get all of these people to come and have a conversation or get a quote from Sonia Sotomayor or whatever, to have a conversation around race, to say what's happening is a racial problem. Everything isn't about race. It's not always about race. Y'all are the ones who keep bringing it up. Y'all are keeping racism alive. These classrooms keep teaching critical race theory. Get rid of that. Stop talking about that. Stop making people uncomfortable. Stop making white students uncomfortable. Stop making other students uncomfortable. When we discuss race and when we talk about the history of race and class and sex and sexual orientation in this country, when we have these conversations, you're making people uncomfortable. You all, the critical race theories and these professors, these liberal professors, you're continuing the issue of race in the courtrooms, bringing up race to the judges and racism to the judges. The media, oh my goodness, they make all this money plastering Colin Kaepernick all over the media, plastering these stories of these police officers who may unlawfully arrest or hurt or beat or even kill somebody, but we don't know the full story. What did they do wrong? We're telling half the story, and then we're getting people riled up. We're getting Black people mad at white people and white people mad at Asian people and Latinx, like we're making everybody mad, and this is just to just call stories. That's all people are trying to do. They just want ratings. CNN wants ratings. Fox News wants ratings. MSNBC wants ratings. Wall Street Journal want to sell papers. New York Press want to sell papers. The Washington Press want to sell papers. Everybody just wants to get clicks and likes and retweets and reposts. This is the political agenda, the liberal agenda. This is why racism is still an issue. It's not because of the racism itself. So let's look on page 46. And let's see what the author says about this and with the statistics. So, national surveys show that the vast majority of whites believe that the United States is a colorblind society or post-racial society. 55% of whites believe that whites and Blacks have about an equal chance of getting ahead in today's society. 7% actually believe that Blacks have a competitive advantage. So very, very few people believe that Black folks actually have an advantage. And usually those people are saying because of reverse racism, because of scholarship opportunities, advancement opportunities, monies, resources that can sometimes be available to African Americans or Black people in the United States. They argue that they actually have an advantage. But over half of white people believe that really doesn't matter what race you're a part of. A similar poll found that 74% of white people believe that Black people living in their community have just as good a chance as white people in finding employment for which they're qualified. White people were even more confident that Black people receive equal treatment in the areas of education. So 80% of white people felt that there was equal access to education. 85% believe there was equal access to housing, which further explains why 2/3, about 66% of white people believe that those who can't get ahead in this country are mostly responsible for their own condition. So now you have more of an agency conversation around why there are disparities or disadvantages within certain groups or between certain groups in comparison to another group. So you can see those statistics. I know that's 2015, that's 7 years ago, that's pre-George Floyd, pre-COVID. So it's going to be interesting to see what those numbers look like after census and all those other kinds of things come out, after all the census data has been analyzed. It's going to be interesting to see what the new statistics will say, right? All right, so if we look at the next slide, something that I believe we've talked about before, racial formation, is part of this conversation, right? And racial formation in the United States is Omi and Winat, Michael Omi and Howard Winat, two sociologists who have created this theory of understanding race in the United States, particularly how we create an analysis for understanding ethnicity, understanding the ways in which ethnic groups will assimilate into certain groups, how class stratification, how nationalism, all these things help us explain race within the US context, right? Racial formation, if you want the more formal definition, is the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed in societies like the USA. And so racial formation specifically looks at certain events as racial projects, right? And we talked about that before. Look at the civil rights movement as a racial project, Black Lives Matter as a racial project, lynching as a racial project, slavery as an ongoing racial project, Jim Crow as a racial project, mass incarceration as a racial project. So all of these events, all of these time periods, these eras, the interaction between the oppressor and the oppressed are these racial projects that are looked at as, and racial projects aren't always negative, right? Sometimes they can be positive. The election of President Obama, the election of Kamala Harris, the nomination and the acceptance of the nomination of Sonia Sotomayor. I mean, so many different examples, right? So these racial projects are looked at as these contests on a socio-political level that exist between racial and ethnic groups, right? And it is a contest over resources. It is a contest over life, over freedom, over what is seen as equality. These are many times sit at the center of the tension between racial and ethnic groups, which is why we have what they call these racial projects. So race exists as an unstable, decentered complex of various social meanings. We talked about race as a social construct and race as a social meaning, and these meanings have different interpretations depending on when and where we are discussing it. So for example, when I just talked about colored has a different meaning in 2022 than it did in 1922. In 1922, if a person were to call me colored, I would not be offended. I would answer, regardless of what my educational status was, regardless of my class status. It was an accepting term, right? Colored. Now in 2022, I would not look at that as an acceptable term. So again, race is decentered, race is complicated, race has different meanings, race has social meanings, and we're going to talk about this later on. I want to say we talk about, I think we have a conversation around the N-word as well, and why certain groups can say it and other groups can't say it, and why is that complicated and how is that fair? But again, that's the complication of race. That's the dynamics of race. I mean, it's even when you look at the 3/5 compromise, how can a person be 3/5 of a person? Well, that was created because the meaning of a body, of a Black body, was different than the meaning of a white body, particularly in terms of who could be represented in Congress. So race is a very complicated and multifaceted ideal that gets transformed and changes via political struggles, via social battles. All of these things carry out, and this goes right into which theory that we talked about in the beginning, conflict theory. It is through conflict that we see social change occur. And so for a racial project to be racist, we must see that there are structures that are dominating based on essentialism or essentialist ideas related to race. And when we talk about essentialist ideas, generally when we talk about that in terms of gender, but there are also these racial essentialist ideas. People who belong to a certain race automatically fits into these certain categories. It's just like gender. Men wear blue, boys wear blue. Men are strong, men are good at math. Women are the nurturers, women wear pink, blah, 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 blah. And so these are the essentialist ideas around gender. Race is the same way. There are these stereotypical notions that we subscribe or we ascribe to biology, that we ascribe to race and the biology and the biologization of race to justify actions. This can be done through, we don't talk about it, I don't think we talk about it in this class, but there's another class where I have a lecture called Killing the Black Body. Killing the Black Body is a book. Oh, who wrote that book? Oh, I forgot, not Harriet Washington. I forgot who wrote Killing the Black Body, but it's basically a book about the ways in which particularly Black women, Black women's bodies have been subject to violence from slavery on down, and then talks about the ways, and even in modern times, how Black women have been forced into sterilization, and their bodies have been politicized, largely due to these racial meanings, these essentialist racial categories of Black women's bodies being harmful to society, particularly harmful to the finances of the state, meaning their bodies are used to deplete resources from the state. That is an example of that essentialist category. That is an example of a racial project. Right? So the welfare queen stereotype of the Black woman. And so the goal, so when we go back to the civil rights movement, the goal of the civil rights movement was twofold. Right? First thing they wanted to do, abolish the overt state-sanctioned systems of oppression and give all US citizens the same rights, privileges, and opportunities regardless of race. So abolish overt state-sanctioned systems of oppression and give all US citizens the same rights and privileges regardless of race. Some people may say that the first goal may have been achieved, maybe. We still don't know. There's still some pretty overt state-sanctioned systems of oppression for sure. Especially if you look at mass incarceration and the documentary 13th, or if you read Slavery by Another Name, or if you read the Good Sisters book, The New Jim Crow. There's so many other ones. So there's definitely still some state-sanctioned systems of oppression, for sure. But we definitely know that the second goal has not been met yet. All US citizens do not have the same rights, privileges, and opportunities regardless of race. But colorblindness says that they do. So colorblind racism is a 21st century racial project that reinforces the same inequality of the 20th century Jim Crow, but just uses the means of invisibility and ignorance. So we know that things are not equal. We know that the status quo is not right. But we're going to pretend that it is. And then instead of addressing it, because now that we've taken down the colored only signs, now that we don't see lynchings, the traditional lynchings anymore, we can say, oh, it doesn't exist anymore. It's invisible. Oh, it's ignorant. But now we don't address unequal education. We don't address environmental racism. We don't address unequal housing. We don't address unequal access to job opportunities. We don't address disparate means of access to wealth and the transfer of wealth from one generation to another, wealth inequality. We don't address the interconnectivity between race and class. But we do it, and we just continue to reinforce the same racism of the 20th century, but this time we just say we don't see it anymore. We're ignorant to it. People laughed at Donald Trump when he said, there was a clip while he was president, and he said, well, the reason why COVID numbers are rising is because we keep testing people. If we stop testing people, the numbers won't rise. And people laughed. How could you say that? That's stupid. You got to test people to see if they got COVID. If they got COVID, then the numbers are going to rise. It's just what it is. But that's exactly what happens with race. That's what colorblind racism is. We keep talking about it. We're going to keep having these issues. The issues exist. Everybody knows COVID still exists, but if we stop testing and we pretend that it doesn't, then we won't have to look at the numbers. But then what's going to happen? A lot of people are going to die. We have to test. We have to look at the numbers. We have to see where the numbers are rising. We have to see where the numbers are falling so that we can know what to do. It's the same way with race. We can ignore it. We have to see it. We have to talk about it. We have to deal with the ugly parts of it. We have to see where we progress. We have to see where we are not progressing to find out what we have to do to be better. So while people laughed at Donald Trump, that is an accurate reflection of the way many people in the United States and ways in which the United States, even as a system, has dealt with hard issues. Just pretend it doesn't exist. So then we go on to the question, well, then how does race matter? On the next slide. How does race matter? In what ways does race matter? You keep telling me racism is still alive, racism is still alive. But I don't see it. We see minorities represented in different places all the time. How is it still alive? Well, just because you see a few does not necessarily mean that that is an accurate reflection of the whole. Some people might say, COVID's not killing people. I don't know anybody who died of COVID. There may be some people who can say, I don't know someone who died of COVID personally. But just because you may not know somebody who died of COVID does not necessarily mean that there are not over 1 million people just in the United States who have either tested positive and hundreds of thousands of people who have died of COVID. I think the number of deaths have actually reached over 1 million, I think, but I'm not sure. But definitely in the hundreds of thousands. But because we live in a society that prides itself on individualism, which is the basis of our Bill of Rights, it's the basis for the documents that help govern this country, we've taken that individualism thing a little bit too far. And now many people are so individualized that many people don't and won't think about the collective. Because I haven't seen anybody personally die of COVID. COVID is a hoax. Some people may believe that. Because I don't see racism, or I don't see where people in my family are racist, or I have a Black professor or a Latino mentor or an Asian dean or whatever. Clearly, race is not an issue. But how many other people of a certain minority group will not have that opportunity, did not have that opportunity because of structural oppression? What did those minorities have to overcome that their white counterparts did not have to overcome in order to be in that position? How many times were they overlooked, underpaid, undervalued? And I guarantee you, if you ask them those questions, they can give you a litany of responses. So race matters in many different ways, but specifically, race matters in these areas. One, education. The ghettoization of Black people prior to the civil rights movement. That's one way in which race is what happened prior to the civil rights movement still affects people today. There's a book, if you're interested, called The Hidden Cost of Being African American. And it talks about wealth inequality between Black and white families. And the interviewer or the interviewers get narratives from various Black families and white families, particularly ones that have money throughout the United States, and ask questions about wealth transfer and how wealth has been transferred and how they got the money to buy this big house or start their business or whatever it is they've been able to do. And what you end up finding is that the policies that were put in place prior to the civil rights movement had a direct effect on the opportunities available to these people who are still alive. I think I gave this example before, but if I did, I'll just go through it really quickly. Those people, soldiers who fought in World War I and, well, particularly like World War II and the Korean War, after the United States had did away with its competition, and now the US and now Great Britain and now these Western countries are the #1 global empires in the world. These are the #1 producers of cars and steel and oil, etc. They became rich. Rich, wealthy, more than wealthy. So this allowed for the United States to be able to provide free assistance to those soldiers who went and fought in those wars. They called it the GI Bill. And when those soldiers got back, many of those soldiers applied and received the GI Bill, and that GI Bill gave them first access to new homes in these suburban areas outside of the city. So most of the homes outside of the city were these suburban homes that were purchased by these soldiers who now basically got free down payments, but now they have to pay for the home. Well, you can pay for it because we're also going to give you college for free. The GI Bill allowed for them to go to college for free. After they got their college education, now they were able to immediately go into a job because there was the 1950s and 60s. So during that time, it wasn't hard for you to get a job after college, especially an associate's degree, bachelor's degree, get a well-paying job, not just a job, a well-paying job. A job where to the point where you can have a job, your wife does not have to have a job because women weren't necessarily allowed in mass to go to college like that. So generally it was men. Men could have a job, work 8 hours a day. The wife can stay home all day, cook, clean, do whatever, which is a whole nother conversation around gender. But the wife can stay home. The father has kids. The father can pay for everything. If the kids decided that they wanted to go to college, they made enough money in their job to send the kids to college and cash it out. And now the kids can graduate from college, get a good job with no loans, no debt, and then begin to stack the wealth that is continuing to transfer over. Why is that able to happen? Because of the opportunities available to them through this GI Bill that was subsidized by the American government. But there were certain people that weren't allowed those GI Bills. Black soldiers, when they came back, mostly Black, and then I think you might have had some soldiers of other minority groups, when they came back, were not allowed to participate in the GI Bill program. So those soldiers did not have access to college. Those soldiers did not have access to homes. Those soldiers did not have the jobs that were available to their white counterparts. So many of them had to work at fast food restaurants, had to work at grocery stores, and their wives, minorities, would end up being maids for the white women on the suburban sides, in the suburban areas, would have to catch the bus and would then be maids for them as a way of bringing some extra income into the home. So now when their kids are ready to go to college, there's no way. They're smart enough, but they don't have the money to go to college. Around the 70s, you start to get scholarships and maybe grants, some loans, but it's not enough money to finance all of these Black kids, Latino kids to go to college, not on scholarships. So now you have to give them loans. And then in the 80s and 90s, the notion of loans becomes a thing. But then everybody's taking out loans, but then there are not enough jobs to hire these people to pay back loans. And now we have a student loan crisis. So while one group was able to transfer wealth, this other group, unfortunately, trying to keep up with that group, end up transferring more debt. And what was the common denominator? The GI Bill that was given to one group that was not given to another group. That is economic ghettoization. When we talk about ghettoization, we talk about social isolation, not just where somebody lives, but the social isolation of a people. That's just one example. If we want to talk about the actual residential ghettoization, then that's where we talk about the white flight, where white people left the cities, took all of the economic resources out of the cities. There was underfunding and lack of financial support in the cities, leaving the cities in ruins where a majority of Black and Latino people live. And that is where you have the urban ghetto that was created in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. If you end up taking an urban class, we go into more detail when we talk about that. That's the actual ghettoization of Black people prior to the civil rights movement that then gets carried out post-civil rights. How does that relate to education? Well, with education, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but education is directly related to residents. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. So we'll put a pin in that part. Brown versus Board of Education, separate and unequal. So Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 says that black and white people can have different structures, have different education, schools, have different churches, have separate everything as long as they are equal. As long as the same resources you put into the white institutions are the same ones you put into the Black institutions. People are like, okay, but now we see that's not the case. The Black institutions were underfunded. The Black schools were not as good as the white schools. The books were not as good. The technology was not as good. The teachers did not get paid as much. So we see that there was a separate and unequal system put in place to perpetuate the racial divide in America. Long years and years and decades of fighting this. And finally, you get to Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board knocks down separate but equal and says that that's not right and knocks down educational inequality. So that means whether you're Black or white, you can now send your child to whatever school that they are zoned for, whatever school that they can get into, whatever school that they can qualify for. So then what happens? It now becomes less of a race thing, so we remove the racial part of it. We're blind to the racial aspect of education, but now we are but now it becomes a class issue. Because instead of focusing on the racial part, instead we will segregate people based on class. If you can afford to live in this neighborhood, regardless of your race, if you can afford to live in this neighborhood, then you can go to this school because this school is funded by the tax dollars in this neighborhood. So if you live in this neighborhood, you can go to this school. If you go to this school, you'll have a great education. If you have a great education, you'll get to college, you'll get a good job, you'll live a good life. But residential segregation says, and redlining, if you know anything about redlining says, we will not allow for Black people to live in these particular areas, even if they can afford it. And if we do, there can only be one. And we will pay realtors money on the back end to not show people of color houses in these areas. We will provide kickbacks to certain companies to ensure that Black people do not move into these areas, even if they can't afford it, because the civil rights movement policies have now created more opportunities for them. So in order to keep them from being able to access the residences that will allow them to go to the schools, that will allow them to get the education, that will allow them to continue in the advancement of their people individually, both individually and socially, we're going to create policies where they will not be allowed to live in certain areas. So now there is this racism in real estate. So now if regardless of your class, Black people are forced to live in ghettoized conditions, ghetto or on the outskirts of the ghetto, so even in lower middle class, working class neighborhoods, then they are forced to go to the same schools as the students who live in the poor and working class ghettos, poor and working class projects, and all of them, whether working class, poor, or middle class, all of them get the same underfunded education, outdated books, underfunded teachers, lack of technology. Then when they are forced to take the same exams as the white students who are not forced to teach, who are not forced to learn under these conditions, and they get lower scores, then they're seen as being not as smart, not as intelligent. So then when it's time to get into college, who ends up taking those positions? Who ends up getting those seats? The students who appear to be smarter. And it's not that they're smarter, it's just that they had more opportunities. So this is where race and class come together. Now, redlining is not an issue. Well, I don't want to say redlining is not an issue. Overt redlining is against the law now. But there are still issues around what school a person can go to based on their zone. And your zone is based on your class. And your class is can largely be based on what race you are a part of. You are more likely to live in a predominantly middle class, upper middle class, good area of town if you are white. Doesn't mean that all white people will live there, but if you are white, the likelihood increases. So race plays a huge role then and now. And because of the things that happened then, it has affected people's experiences and opportunities now. Race dictates jobs. Who can have access to what jobs? Race, depending on where you live, dictates how much pollution may be in your area. Food access, food deserts, oh my goodness. Food deserts are very, very, very strong in the rural, in predominantly Black, predominantly minority rural areas. You might go 5-10 miles without seeing healthy food options, especially in the South. The level of violence that exists, overt criminal violence that exists, can be divided along racial lines, not because one racial group is instinctively more violent than another, but the lack of resources and the competition for resources can lead to violence regardless of race. School quality is absolutely connected to race. The less white you are, the further your proximity from whiteness and the lower your class, the more likely that your school will not be to the same standard. It doesn't mean that the teachers won't be as good, and it doesn't mean that they're not fighting to do the best that they can with those students, but it could be a lot better with more money. So race is directly related to, in many ways, your social class. Race is also connected to the labor market. Black people and Latinos still earn less than white people and Asian people across all major occupational groups to this day. There is still a racial economic gap. You also still have the issue of the model minority. Where Asians are looked at as a model minority because many of them supersede white people when it comes to certain positive statistics. And so because of that, they are seen as the people that everyone needs to be like, which causes many people to overlook their own unique racial challenges. So these are the ways in which race matters in our country, and why it can be detrimental to maintain a notion of colorblindness and a discourse of colorblindness when discussing life in American society. So what I would like for you to do now, we can take a break, and if you look at the next couple slides, it's basically just what I have on your syllabus. So you can either look at the slides or you can look at the syllabus, whichever one, about your directions for the discussion questions. And if you go to slide 8, you will see your discussion board assignment called Colorblind Society. You are required to engage in the discussion board post entitled Colorblind Society, and you will answer the following questions. So if you are a white student, I want you to answer this question. How would your family and friends respond to you explaining how the colorblind perspective harms both white people and persons of color? What steps would you take to make the conversation more comfortable? How would you, I'm actually thinking about this as I'm writing this, how would you teach your family members or friends the dangers of colorblindness? Use information from the lecture to explain what you would say. If you are a student of color, how has the colorblind perspective shaped your understanding of race in your life and the larger society? Use information from the lecture and or readings to explain how colorblindness and the issues around it have affected your life. And the same thing for the first one, use information from the lecture or readings to explain what you would say. All instructions of the previous slides, or if you get the instructions from the syllabus, should be fulfilled before 11:59 p.m. on February 4th. Same time that all of your assignments are due. Okay. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, inbox me, or come into my office hours, and I'll be more than happy to assist you. All right, if you want, you can take a break. And then we're going to go into the next part of this lecture where we talk specifically about Benia Silva's theory on colorblind racism theory. Okay. All right, so talking about a colorblind society. So a colorblind society says that people are not judged based on race in today's society. Another reason or another way to explain it is by saying that I don't see color. We all have probably heard that term before, where a person says, I don't see color, I just see a human being, right? And while that may be a nice or an attempt at being post-racial or in an attempt at being fair or equal, what essentially it does is it erases or it attempts to erase a person's humanity, a person's reality, and a person's lived experiences. And so it is important that we recognize race, we acknowledge race, and we see race while not allowing for race to be the canon used to determine whether a person is good or bad, right or wrong, righteous or unrighteous, civil or uncivil, or anything in between. So again, putting this in a historical context, prior to the civil rights movement or the civil rights era, the racist feelings that many white people had towards non-white people were very blatant, right? We talked about Jim Crow. We've talked about the whites only signs, the colored only signs, white water fountains, colored water fountains, schools. You're also talking about this is the era of the civil rights movement, of the water hoses, lynchings, etc. It's very, very upfront in terms of race. You're talking about an era where a white person can get on TV and blatantly say, use the N-word and say that I believe that that the N-word and that white people should be separate, live in separate places, and that's just what it is. And that person will be met with applause and will be met with confetti and probably a seat at a government table, right? A seat of power. So it was no question that there was a racial divide in the country. Everybody saw it, everybody agreed, the whole world saw it, it was real, right? And then there weren't much repercussions for the behavior, right? Even the very overt racist actions, like the murder of Emmett Till. I don't know if you all have been watching that on television. It's called Women of the Movement. I can't remember. I think it's on CBS or ABC. But it deals with several events during the civil rights movement and how women sat at the center and remain powerful, steadfast, and leaders within certain parts of the civil rights movement. But even those very blatant acts of aggression and acts of violence, like the murder of Emmett Till, the murder of Medgar Evers, the murder of Dr. King, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, these very overt, violent, terrorist acts oftentimes went with little to no justice for the victims. And so we knew that racism existed, and we knew that racism was alive and well, and it was the order of the day. After the political victories of the civil rights movement, when we talk about the political victories, we're talking about the Brown v. Board of Education case of 1954, which was the first major kind of landmark victory that set the stage for everything else. We wouldn't get another, I would say, another policy victory on a federal level until 1964. 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act, right, which was really the first act policy to explicitly state that it is against the law to discriminate against any person based on race. And then shortly after that, you got the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which says that all people, all US citizens should and do have the right to vote in all elections. And it is against the law to obstruct the vote of any citizen in the United States. All right, then you have the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which says that it is against the law, so that made redlining illegal. It is against the law to stop somebody from living in a certain area that they can afford to live in. So you had all of these victories, you had all of these political victories specifically, as well as certain economic programs, WIC programs, Head Start, all of these programs that were put in place to help poor people and alleviate poverty that was part of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society program. And so because of these victories, because of the economic programs, because of the passing of policies that were put in place in the 1960s, many people believed America had finally fulfilled its promise. The promise that when we look back at racist America, Joe Fagan talks about in the Constitutional Convention. Maybe finally the United States was fulfilling this promise and things are now going to be equal, as was said in the Constitution. In addition to that, it was the restructuring of the language. After that, you do not hear the N-word as being used by white people as liberally without consequence. It'll be rare to hear it after you start to see colored television. Mm-hmm. After around 1968, you don't hear that. Now, doesn't mean that you won't hear it, but you might hear it in like a joke. Like, let's say you watch a I don't know if you or your parents watch what's the name of that show? All in the Family, or Archie Bunker or something like that. They used it on that show. And actually recently on the show I just watched, a white boy used it. It was a comedy, but it was used in the context of trying to tell people not to. But yeah, so you'll hear it, but you won't hear it in terms of from a political figure like you would in the 1960s and 50s. So it was even the restructuring of the use of racist language now in public spaces. So laws were passed, traditions were altered. But you and I both know, just because a law is passed doesn't mean that just because somebody passes a law not to do something doesn't mean that people are going to stop. We have laws that prohibit drinking and driving, but people have a drink, take shots, and then get behind the wheel all the time. We have laws that prevent drug use. People use drugs all the time. We have laws that prevent people from jaywalking, and people jaywalk all the time. So just because there are laws around something does not mean that that thing does not exist. Just because there are laws preventing racism does not mean racism doesn't exist. What that means is that if a person is caught being racist, these laws protect the victims so that these people are punished. The hope is that the more people are punished, the less people are likely to do it. For example, just like any other law. Laws against killing don't stop people from murdering people. But hopefully what it does is it reduces the amount of people who will consider it. So maybe before I go and murder this person, I got to think, am I willing to spend the rest of my life in prison? Do I want to? Nah, maybe I should do it. Doesn't mean other people don't murder, but you would have more murders if there wasn't a law that protected the people who got murdered, or at least gave them justice. So then the question is, how well do the systems uphold the laws around race and racism? And what we see is oftentimes, if it is not as egregious as a person who is using the N-word while beating someone of another race on tape, very blatant, unless it's something that extreme, oftentimes there might not be justice. And then sometimes even in those cases, there's still not justice, i.e. Rodney King. Now granted, the police officers didn't use the N-word, but they were beating him on tape. And there was no, you might know the Rodney King story, right? So sometimes you still don't get justice. So with this idea of the laws around race is still, and the issue of race and racism is still a problem in the country, and the laws should be there to protect the victims, and then they don't always do that. So unfortunately, now the idea of race is dominated by what we've been talking about, this notion of color blindness. And so color blindness says that we don't see color, or we fail to see racism as a structural phenomenon. So that's one way in which we describe color blindness or a colorblind society. Race is not structural, meaning if you are not successful at something, it is due to your own individual shortcomings. There is not a racist police system. There is not a racist education system. There is not a racist healthcare system. There may be racist doctors, racist police officers, racist politicians, but the system itself is good because the United States does not agree with racism. That's a colorblind mentality. A colorblind mentality quiets anyone who sees racism as a societal issue. It's not a societal issue, it's an individual issue, just like what I said. It fails to critique contemporary social issues. Racism is a thing of the past. Yes, we were wrong for slavery. Yes, we were wrong for Jim Crow. Yes, we were wrong for lynching. Yes, Dr. King, Ralph David Abernathy, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, and all these people had every right to fight for their rights because racism was a problem at that time. But after that, new issues, contemporary issues, these things are not racist. These are just bad people doing bad things. George Floyd just met the wrong police officer at the wrong time. But Minnesota is not a racist place. And the Minnesota Police Department is not a racist police department. It's just those people. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of those bad apples, those individual bad apples, get rid of them. So it fails to critique contemporary social issues and oftentimes individualizes the issues within contemporary events. We only look at race as a thing of the past. It provides white people with a false bubble of reality in which they can exist. Colorblindness feels good. Not talking about critical race theory feels good. In fact, if we look at much of the language around the laws or the language within the proposed laws, around critical race theory, much of it says you cannot make people feel uncomfortable. That's creating a false bubble of reality. We don't want people to feel bad or feel a certain way based on real events. So it creates this false bubble of reality in which many white people can exist and can feel good about themselves if we say that we now live in a colorblind society and race does not play a role in advantage or disadvantage. Now, many white people can feel good and safe that I have what I have because I work for it, and I don't have to worry about treating anybody else good or bad, or believing that I live in a system that provides advantage and disadvantage for people, and I can believe in my country, and I can believe in my land, and I can be proud, and blah, 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 blah. And not to say that people, to some degree, for whatever reason they feel, can't be proud of certain parts. But in reality, these are other parts that still need a lot of adjustment and still need a lot of work. So it provides this comfortability that allows people to feel okay and not have a critical lens for the country, for the state, for the areas in which they live. It provides a false idea around meritocracy. So it says that all people who are successful based on their own merits. And I just gave you that example, a clear example of racial differentiation happening with the GI Bill and how that has a direct effect on my generation and even your generation of people who are able to have access to jobs and opportunities and security and debt versus wealth transfer, debt transfer versus wealth transfer. Again, if you read the Hidden Cost of Being African-American, two sociologists, it breaks it down. And I mean, there's so much other, you can literally Google GI Bill race or something and you'll find all kind of information on it. But absolutely, direct reflection, which lets us know that it's not only about merit. It's not to say that merit does not exist for anybody. I believe, or all of you who have gotten to college to some degree had to put in some level of work, but there is more work that people of marginalized groups have to put in to become successful than people of non-marginalized groups, or there are hurdles that people of marginalized groups have to overcome that people of non-marginalized groups oftentimes don't even know exist. So it's not just merit, there are other points of advantage and disadvantage that either propels people or can inhibit people from success. And then also racism costs. We actually pay more taxes to maintain prisons to support the disproportionate healthcare outcomes. And we will pay less taxes if we had less prisons, more schools, and we actually provided equal healthcare for everyone, regardless of race or class. We would actually pay less. So racism and inequality is costing the majority of us more. The super rich, well, they're okay. But we're talking about the middle class and poor working class, middle class, maybe even a little bit of the upper middle class. Not your Jeff Bezos, not your Warren Buffetts, not your Bill Gates. And this notion of a colorblind society is not something that was just adopted just by white people either. Or not just working class people, or not just people, politicians, entertainers, common people across races, across sexes. Many of them have adopted this idea. More white people than non-white people, but some non-white people. What we call this post-racial. We talked about this before as well. We call this post-racial. And it's another way of describing color blindness. And we talked about the event that was used to denote the post-racial society that we live in. And what was it? It was the election of President Obama. If we can put a Black man in office, and it takes more than just the Black vote to do that. It takes the white vote, it takes the Latinx vote, it takes the Asian vote, it takes the women vote, poor vote, rich vote, middle class vote, all votes, gay vote, straight vote, to help ensure that this man got in office, then clearly our society is post-racial if people don't mind a Black president. But let's see what this Black president says about that topic. I want you to click on that link, and I want you to go to the time 1 minute and 28 seconds and watch about a minute and a half, where he actually talks about post-racial, being in a post-racial society. So click on that, go to that minute, watch for about a minute and a half, and then come back and we will visit this last slide. So, as you can see, President Obama, even the person himself who was said to have represented the post-racial society, said, no, it's not the case, right? That's not the case. To suggest that is to erase the contemporary social issues that we're dealing with. It is also to, and while we can acknowledge the progress that has been made, it's also necessary for us to realize that undoubtedly there are some people who exist who just did not want to see a Black person become president. So do we live in a post-racial society? No. According to President Obama, have we made progress? Yes. But even before President Obama engaged in that interview, a man by the name of Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who is a sociologist and former president of the American Sociological Association, says we need to challenge this notion of a colorblind society. Because I don't believe that this thing exists. But as we know with sociology, you can't just say, I don't think, based on a hunch. You got to prove it. Do some type of research to collect some type of data and analyze it to prove your hunch or disprove your hunch. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva said that racism does exist in this so-called colorblind society. And there have been several not studies, but there have been several authors, Thernstrom, two pieces by Thernstrom, a couple other authors, who put forth this notion of a colorblind society. And Bonilla Silva says that although the racism is much more subtle than the blatant racism before the civil rights movement, it is still prevalent in our world. And what he did was he wanted to test this. So he calls this subtle racism colorblind racism. And he categorizes this racism into four major frames. Frames are ways in which we interpret race-related issues. That is a frame, ways in which we interpret race-related issues. And so these are the four frames that Eduardo Bonilla Silva uses to discuss colorblind racism: abstract liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, minimization of racism. We'll talk about each of these in detail. And so what he did was he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to test racism. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. The book came out in 2003. But it took him years to collect the data. Well, his graduate students probably collected the data, but it took him a while. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to gather data on over 1,000 people, both Black and white, to examine the issues of race in contemporary society. So he interviewed college students, and people who resided in Detroit for information. Now, why do you think he decided to use college students in Detroit to get information on race? He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone somewhere in the South, in the Midwest, anywhere he wanted to, New York, LA, North Dakota, Texas, wherever he wanted. Why do you think he chose specifically college students? He could have chose any group of people. That's something I want you to think about. You can pause it here. I'm getting ready to tell you, but you can pause it and think about, why do you think he chose that particular group? And if you look at the literature on race before this time, and well, actually even the literature on race now, particularly the quantitative data, when we look at census data and attitudes towards, you see that a lot of times in attitudes towards race, attitudes towards women, attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, blah, blah, blah. A lot of that gets assessed through census data. And what a lot of that data shows is that the group of white people that are seen to typically be less racist are college students, young college students in the North, which means, and it deals with three different discourses around race in terms of comparison intra-racially with white people. One, people say that younger white people tend to be less racist than older white people. And the further we get from civil rights, the less racist white people are. That's what many people believe. Many people also believe that the more educated you are, the less racist you are. So racists are typically going to be people who are uneducated, less than a high school diploma, haven't really experienced people outside of their own racial group. These people will be more racist. So the more education a person has, the less racist they are. And then the further you live from the South is still stereotypically seen to be a racist place. So what Bonilla Silva says is, well, if I interview the age cohort that is the least racist, young people, the education cohort that is supposed to be the least racist, college students, and the regional cohort that is seen to be the least racist, people in the North, and people who live in the city are in big cities are said to be less racist than people who live in more rural, more country areas. So if I interview people who live in a big city, Detroit, this group that I'm interviewing are supposed to be the least racist people in the United States. Now, if I would have done this research in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Georgia, in places that are seen to be stereotypically more racist, that have a much more poignant racist history, then that would be my response if I were to release this book. And they would say, well, of course you're going to get racist responses from people in the South or somebody who lives in the country. Those people are always racist. So he said, I'm going to go to the most liberal white people I could find so that nobody can say that I tried to get racist people to say something racist. So that's what he did. And so in this book, he sums up the data from thousands of interviews from these young Black and white college students to see how, if and how much racism still exists in this colorblind post-racial society that we live in. And this is what he found. He found many, many, many examples of these specific frames that he calls colorblind racism. First, he says that one way in which racism is couched or blinded or covered in this colorblind society is through what he calls abstract liberalism. Abstract liberalism. And what he means by this is that oftentimes what he would hear from his white interviewees, the white students that he interviewed, was that there would be a lot of talk about the history of individualism, liberalism, equality in the United States and in Europe. We live in a country where we promote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We live in a country where white people fought in the Civil War for the freedom of African Americans because they knew that slavery was wrong, and they gave their lives and they died for us to end slavery. We live in a free market where everybody has the right to get a business, open a business, and participate in the free market, participate in capitalism. Just because Warren Buffett is rich, just because Bill Gates is rich, doesn't mean everybody can't do it. If you have a good idea, and if you're able to promote that idea, and you're smart enough and you're innovative enough, you can do it too. We live in a society where everybody has that opportunity. Why? Because of our mantras of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because of our belief in the free market, because we have stated in our documents that all men are created equal. What Bonilla Silva says is that this liberal talk is only abstract. The rapper Common in the movie Selma, about the March on Selma for voting rights, said justice for all just ain't specific enough. Meaning just because you say justice for all, just because you say all men are created equal, does not necessarily mean that that is the case. You have to be specific. Justice for all, who is all? Does all include Black people? Because during the time where the people who are considered to be forefathers and foremothers of this country said that all men are created equal, these were people who also left that place to participate in a system called slavery, where they enslaved men and women for the rest of their lives, while saying that all men are created equal. So what do you mean when you say that? Because it's not specific. It's very abstract. And it is not a part of the American practice, although it is written in the American documents. So this takes us back to what Fagan was talking about in Racist America. Liberal ideas in the United States are abstract and they do not apply. If they did, there would be no need for a civil rights movement. There would be no need for a Voting Rights Act of 65 or a Civil Rights Act of 64, because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the 1860s and 70s would have applied. But because they did not, 100 years later, you have to fight a similar fight to make sure that what was said in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment is specific to certain groups of people. So abstract liberalism is something that was spewed by a lot of the white interviewees, when in actuality it did not exist. There was also this meritocratic view, we talked about that, where people felt that people were rewarded based on their merit. If you work hard, you'll be successful. If you go to school, if you get the grades, you'll be successful, which is why we don't need affirmative action. If you just get it right, if you just do it and you graduate, and you'll get your job. Somebody will notice, but that's not always the case. So we need specific laws. We need specific policies, not just to say, hire the person that's best qualified, because a lot of people won't do that. They will hire the person who is qualified that they want to work with. So affirmative action says we need to be specific and say you need, and we'll talk about affirmative action, like the specifics of it later, but it allows for more specifics to help ensure that more people of color or people from marginalized groups at least have opportunities for jobs, college, etc. It also, abstract liberalism also explains away the criminal system and places individual choice on the basis for criminal behavior. You stole from that store, you're a criminal, you need to go to jail. If a police officer is hurting somebody, they must have done something wrong, because a police officer wouldn't do that. So they had to have done something wrong. Why? Because we live in a society that is fair, that is equal, that is just. They say they are here to protect and serve. If you steal, you go to jail, period. There's nothing in between. So we're not going to talk about poverty. We're not going to talk about unequal access to healthy food options. Yes, stealing is wrong, but why did the person steal? Should they go to jail? Or should we try to deal with the larger issues of creating more opportunities for this person so they don't have to steal? These are the questions that we need to answer. Some people may say, well, no, that's not right. They shouldn't steal anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, okay, that's fine too, if that's how we want to look at it. Then when that same thing happens to a little white boy or a little Asian boy, are we going to use that same tactic? Are we going to say, doesn't matter, take them and put them in jail for however long? Oftentimes it doesn't happen on both cases. The little black boy may get immediately put in jail or taken downtown. The little white boy may get scolded. What's wrong with you? Let's take you to your parents. Let your parents see he's making a mistake. Keep an eye on him. I don't want to see him do that again. It's different. So this abstract liberalism is not applied in the same way. Right? Or the fact that white people have the right to live in segregated neighborhoods and ignoring the systems that keep non-white people from moving into predominantly white spaces, i.e. what we talked about, redlining. And then there are even examples of modern day redlining even now. And there's actually proof that redlining existed after it was illegal all the way up into the 90s. So abstract liberalism is a strong frame that is used to justify the inequality that exists in our society. The next one is naturalization. Naturalization says that segregation and racial separation are natural occurrences. Meaning, listen, when I go into the student lounge, when I go into these areas, all the Black people are sitting together. The Black people have the student union. The Latin Americans have the student union. The Asians have the Asian student union. Everybody goes to their own people. It's a natural occurrence. They only hang out with each other, so why do we have to force people to hang out with each other? And is it a problem if somebody wants to hang out with certain groups over another or a certain person over another? Isn't that segregation? Yes and no. You can hang out with whoever you want to hang out with. You can go to or be around whoever you choose to be around. And if they want to be around you, they can accept being around you or not. And you should not have to be forced to be around any person that you don't want to be around. But that is not segregation. Segregation says that a person is not allowed access to an opportunity, to an institution, to a place that can help them better their quality of life. That is segregation. Choice is separation. If a person chooses to go to one school over another, you have women that choose to go to a women's institution because that's what they prefer than a mixed gender institution. You have Black people that choose to go to a Black college over a mixed race college or a college that is more racially diverse. And that's their choice. That's separation. And separation is not against the law. Separation is a personal choice. You have the right to go and choose whatever option you feel works best for you. On the other hand, if you tell somebody you are not allowed to go to this institution, if you tell a woman she's not allowed to go to a school where there's boys, or you tell a Black person they're not allowed to go to a school, even though that school has their major, that school has what they need, that school has the opportunities that they need to be successful, and they are forced to go to another school that may not be what they need to be successful, then that is segregation and that is wrong. Separation says, I choose to live in this neighborhood. Segregation says you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood. So there's a difference between naturalization and you naturally wanting to be around people within your own group, and then segregation, which is mean you are forced out. And typically that force leads to less resources and some level of poverty, whether it be economic poverty, cultural poverty, social poverty, political poverty, some level of poverty. Then you have cultural racism. So cultural racism is when you use culture to explain the inadequacies of minority groups. So it replaced biological racism. There was a time where people felt biology explained racial differences. It explained the ignorance of Black people and the intelligence of white people. White people had more brains. White people were naturally smarter. Black people were the products of apes. Black people came from Africa, from the jungle. But after like the early 20th century, that was kind of like, okay, that's kind of stupid because first of all, that's wrong. So we have to stop saying that. And so then what they started to do was they started to replace biological racism with cultural racism. Well, it's not that white people are smarter than Black people. It's that white people value education. Their culture allows them to value education. They're more serious about their education than Black people are. Well, it's not that the reason why, another example would be of cultural racism, is the reason why Black people are more likely to be arrested and be in jail is because they're more likely to commit crimes. They're just naturally more violent. They're more angry. And maybe they have a right to be because they go through so much, but they just keep killing each other. They're just violent. They just have a violent culture in their music and in the things they say, and just violent. But why is it that Latinx people have not caught up to white people in terms of economic advancement? Well, I mean, they just don't work as hard. They don't value education. And they don't really want to learn the language. They don't care to be a part of the American system. They're a little bit lazy. Using these cultural stereotypes and myths, because these are all myths, to explain why there's some differentiation. Right? And so even if we look at social media and the internet, These things have kind of exposed the racism that we thought had subsided. We thought no longer exists when we see memes, when we see TikToks, when we see videos. So all this is an example of cultural racism. And then lastly, minimization of racism. Minimization of racism says race is no longer a central factor. There is a minimization of racism within discourse among white people. In fact, this notion of the minimization of racism has then been supported by certain phrases like you're being sensitive, you're hypersensitive. Me and all my friends say it. Or he's playing the race card. What does playing the race card mean? Oftentimes it means that a person is using race to say why they may or may not have a certain advantage, or why there may be a disadvantage. It's a way of blaming. Saying somebody is playing the race card is saying that they're blaming the victim. A race card itself does not necessarily exist. But if we say that every person of color is playing the race card, then we're saying that they're making up excuses for their lived experiences and their reality. And oftentimes what we find is this is used to help extend and justify social, racial issues for a long time until it blows out of hand. So before Trayvon Martin, you had Sean Bell, you had Oscar Grant, you had so many other people, but everybody who said that this was a social issue, this was an issue with race and the police, said that these people were what? In 2005 and in 2006 and 2008 and 2010, for all those years, they said those people were playing the race card. Not until Trayvon Martin. Not until Mike Brown did people say, you know what, maybe they're not playing the race card. Maybe this is a real issue. But by then, how many men, how many women had died? So we have to be careful when we tell people that they're playing the race card or that they're being hypersensitive, because maybe they're not being sensitive. Maybe this is a real issue and we need to take it seriously. But when we say people are playing the race card, when we say that people are being sensitive, then we are minimizing their racial experiences. When we say that minorities are the ones that are bringing it up and racism still exists because we talk about critical race theory, then we are minimizing race and we are falling under that last frame of minimization of racism. All right, so with that being said, if you have any questions about what we've talked about, what I've discussed, what you will discuss in your discussion boards, feel free to reach out to me during my office hours. We'll talk more. Look forward to hearing from you, look forward to seeing you. And you will be getting your grades periodically. So as you turn them in, and then I'll return your grades back to you. If you have any questions, reach out, email, inbox, or join the office hours. With that being said, have a great week, great weekend. See you soon.